The role we do as corporate investigators carries with it a great responsibility to establish the facts in line with key ethical principles, particularly as the consequences of a poorly executed investigation can be absolutely significant to people, organizations, and operations. We got together as a community of practitioners, of subject matter experts in corporate investigations from widely diverse backgrounds around the world, various industries, sectors, both in house and external or consulting corporate investigators. And we agreed on a common set of tenets that are integral to conducting effective and robust corporate investigations. We call these our 10 guiding principles. And we've also put together some good practice guidance around this. It's a start. It's not, a comprehensive list, but it's a start, and it's intended to be used as a guide or as a reference point for when you're putting together your own guidelines or principles in-house. And we hope that this will help inspire and encourage others to adopt a code of ethics for your in-house investigations teams, and to make sure that everything we do is really following these key fundamental principles. I'd like to thank all of our subject matter experts who were involved in working groups and in putting together our principles. And it's a really big step in towards our journey to professionalize corporate investigations.
When we look at the principles, these can really apply across any type of investigation, whether that's something that's seemingly a minor HR breach, all the way up to your complex fraud or your bribery and corruption, whatever type of case that may be. Any investigation should adopt these principles. So let's have a look at what they are. So the first one that we're going to look at is compliance, and that's compliance with everything from law, policies, procedures, and organizational policies. And it sounds pretty straightforward. There's rules and you've just got to follow them, and that will make you compliant as an investigator. But sometimes it can be a bit tricky. And I think the thing about investigations is rarely is anything black and white. There's always this gray in between that can be a tricky line to tread. Whether that's health and safety legislation sometimes being at odds with employment law. So what's the balance there? Or whether you're an international organization and the law in one land doesn't fit with that of another. And this is something that I've seen in organizations where you have a policy where we report all matters of theft to the police, for example. In other countries, that could have major repercussions for those involved in those investigations that might not sit well with your company ethos. So if somebody is going to receive a physical harm and punishment, whether that's hands chopped off or whatever that may be, does that sit well with you as an organization? Is that what you'd want to happen? So there becomes that sort of conflict on your different policies that you have. So sometimes it's about not just following blindly every policy you have in place or every law legislation. It's about knowing what those are and then balancing what's the right thing to do in that case. And it's about the right people making the decisions and the right decision makers being involved.
Thanks. Another very important principle is confidentiality. Ensuring that you institute every case, you should institute a need to know rule. It should be embedded in your policies and procedures as well. Restricting information to those whose access to that information is absolutely necessary to conduct official duties relating to an investigation. I think that this is one that I have lots of issues with. There are certain, obviously, sometimes senior managers or directors who believe that they have an automatic right to know, and they don't have an automatic right to know about the fact that an investigation has been instigated. They may need to know further along the line if there's something they need to manage, but it's really important to know how to manage this information very carefully. And what I tend to do is put a matrix in place showing who needs to know what and when. So, for example, some people may need to know that simply that an investigation is underway in their area of operations, because they may need to provide me with access to their premises or information, but they will not be privy to any of the details. And I often ask, well, why do you need to know? When people ask me, I need to know this, well, why do you need to know? And if you can't give me an example that is linked to your official duties or linked to that investigation, that's, you don't need to know. And it's something that investigators really need to hold fast to this, and also to protecting all of the information about witnesses, subjects, and in the investigation itself. So the other thing I try to explain as well with senior managers who are asking, why can't they know a bit more, is that, I might need to interview you. You might, about to understand contextual factors. I might need to interview as an informational witness as part of this investigation, and you being in the know will compromise the integrity of your testimony. I also might need to who knows, interview you as an enabler. You might turn out to be one of the enablers of misconduct. So it's really important to make sure that I normally put together an org chart and a matrix and decide who needs to know about each case. And normally it's the investigator, our supervisor, and in some cases it will be the CEO if it's serious, depending on the severity of the case. There should always be a well thought through procedure and matrix for disclosures. Confidentiality rules help to protect all the parties to an investigation and the integrity of the investigation itself. There needs to be a very strong system of reciprocal confidentiality between the company and the employees. And also recognize that human nature, people really find it hard to keep matters confidential. So it's really an active concealment of information causes stress. People tend to tell their families or their close colleagues. I've had cases where it was the whistleblower, him or herself, who went out and disclosed the fact that they'd reported the issue to us, to others, and then that really backfired on them, because that's how we were going to protect you. So it's really important to impress upon the parties to an investigation the importance of not speaking to anyone and really getting it clear. One of the first questions I ask is, who have you told? Who knows about this? So that we can try and restrict that information, particularly now in this era of increased ethical scrutiny. Some of you, if you're familiar with Alison Taylor's work, she does a lot of ethical research, but she talks about the fact that one of the key accountability mechanisms of today is simply employee activism, leaking information out. Like, leaking is a new whistleblowing, and investigative journalism can just expose an investigation as it progresses. I've had people say to me, look, if you don't conduct this investigation swiftly enough, I might have to put my concerns over Twitter. And that's big nightmare, but that is a possibility nowadays that investigators in the past didn't have to deal with. So it's really important to really embed confidentiality across the organization, the concept of what does it mean, no loose talk in emails, protectively mark your documents, there is no automatic right to know, encrypt and password protect, have matrices, and we'll go in a bit into more detail about this in the breakout session. But I think it's really important to get into the mindset that you need to know what happened, so what happened, and not who said it happened, and be very wary of procedures that focus, as I said earlier, on the motivation of the reporter. We all know about the case, the Barclays case, where the CEO attempted to uncover the identity of a whistleblower and he was fined for a conduct breach. Really important that you do not focus on who said, but on what has been said.
So then we're going to look at fairness, and I think one of the easiest ways to think about having a fair investigation is to look to disprove and disprove all the points. So if you keep that balance in mind, what can I look for that's going to prove this, and what can I look for that's going to disprove this? That's really, really helpful. And when it comes to fairness, I often think about the investigator who's the storyteller. And I've seen before where a complaint came in of sexual harassment, and the person that was assigned the case, the first thing they did was read the whistleblowing text, and then they said, I know what's happened here. this person obviously gave them a bit of the come on, and then it got a bit too much, and now they're scared, and then they've done this. And there was no way you could tell that from the 3-line text that had come through on the whistleblowing text. And so they're clearly, to me, not the right investigator, because they're putting the story together before they've even investigated. So are they going to be impartial? Are they going to be fair? Or are they just going to look for the stuff that fits their version of what they think's happened? And just the other thing to think about as well is actually being fair is not necessarily treating everybody the same. It's treating people according to their needs within the confines of the rules. And so that's just an important point to flag.
Thanks. Next, independence. Is an investigator truly independent? I often get asked that question. If you're employed by the organization, do you lack independence by virtue of the fact that you're internal? That can sometimes be the case, but it's really important that organizational structures strengthen independence, that you have when I was head of investigations in-house, I made sure that I had a line to an independent audit committee, board of trustees, or an independent line, so that I'm not in the direct line of operations. And also the same could be said of external investigators, because they could lack independence if they're being paid for by the organization. So ultimately, it's really a matter of professional integrity and accountability to a higher moral calling, which is why for the ACI, our association, it's really important that all investigators who are part of our community sign up to these principles, and because it's our professional integrity that is on the line. And of course, if once we become an accredited profession, we'll also have professional duties to uphold. So it's really important that the investigator is free from any conflicts of interest or influence. Even the appearance of a conflict could be problematic. If you've interviewed that person before, or done a case with that person before, or them as socially, or even if you've got children at the same school, you may want to recuse yourself from that investigation, so as not to give the appearance that you're in any way conflicted. Independence also speaks to ensuring that investigations are only instigated for just or ethical reasons. I do recall a very senior manager once saying to me, "Mary, I want you to investigate person X. I don't like them. Just find out everything you can about that person. What can you find?" Absolutely no, I will not be doing that investigation. There is a process in place for us to instigate an investigation, and that does not meet any standard of predication, i.e. reasonable basis to instigate an investigation. So there should be, it's really important to stand your ground as an investigator, to not have any self-serving interests, and be free from any undue influence.
So next up, we have integrity. And I know this is a bit of a buzzword at times, but it's really important. And, doing the right thing at all times, even when no one's looking, and even if this is countercultural, is tricky at times. It can be really, really hard to maintain integrity at all times, especially when pressure gets placed on you by senior management, especially when you realize the impact something can have on an organization. I know of investigators that know that the investigation they're doing will mean they won't get a bonus for the next 3 years because of the financial impact this is going to have on the organization. But it's, doing that right thing anyway, doing the investigation thoroughly and properly. It can also be hard because you may have sympathy for the person involved. The rationalization they have for doing what they were doing can strike a chord. And so the other thing is as well, you could be dealing with the most annoying person in the world who you don't have the time of day for. And that can also be a tricky thing to balance out, investigating that in a fair and with integrity. And what about if the offence is so heinous and goes against every moral fibre of your being? Can that impact the integrity you have of how you're doing that investigation? I think just having awareness of it and making sure that at all times you're not compromising on the ethical and moral principles that the role of the investigator has, and making sure that you're leaving the decision making to those who should be making the decision, and you're making sure that your investigation is just that. It's the investigation to let someone else make those decisions. Sometimes I think the weight of the responsibility can seem overwhelming as an investigator, but as an investigator, your role is to investigate it properly, and the role of someone else is to make that decision as to what happens.
Thanks. Do you want to cover objectivity, Kate?
Yeah, so objectivity is about taking each case on its own merits. Don't be swayed by people who want to ask you your decisions. This is something I see all the time. It's you come out of an investigation meeting. What do you think? Was he lying to you? And I bet all of us here have asked other people that question as well, because you want to know, if someone's speaking to someone, you want to know, do you think he was telling the truth? Do you think he was lying? But it's not the role of the investigator to do that. So the more we can get away from encouraging investigators to sort of form those opinions that can then influence how they write their report or how they're reporting on things is really important. And actually sometimes it's the minor cases where this can be even harder, because often in HR grievances, the person who's investigating the grievance then has to make a decision. And I always train people to separate it out. So if you're investigating and making a decision on a grievance, treat it as a two-phase project. Do your investigation, then make your findings separately. Treat it as two separate phases, because otherwise you're not going to be objective, and you're already thinking about your decision all the way through the investigation, which is going to impact it.
Thanks. Professionalism, Kate mentioned earlier, the ABC of an investigator: assume nothing, believe no one, check everything. It's really important not to ensure that those people who are conducting investigations are trained to conduct investigations. I have worked in organizations where people were double hatting. Perhaps it wasn't their first role. They've never done an investigation before, and all of a sudden they're conducting a sexual harassment investigation. I mean, that's just out of the question. Imagine speaking to a complete stranger about intimate sexual details. You're not trained or qualified to deal with their trauma, and also of trying to determine the facts when you have no grounding in evidence collection and gathering and what constitutes evidence. So it's really important to get trained and qualified people to conduct your investigations. And if they're not trained and qualified, they should be supervised by somebody who is. It's also important to look for the right investigator. The right investigator is the person who has the right mindset, who is also able to assess conflicts of interest, and also has the requisite expertise for that type of investigation. Professionalism also speaks about following a methodical and planned process throughout your investigation.
Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to labour the point, but I sometimes think that training for investigators is way down the priority list, and I think that's completely wrong. I know when I worked in the police, I was absolutely astounded how many police officers from the police, but also lawyers who are representing the cases in the criminal justice system, just didn't understand the disclosure rules. And disclosure was something that impacts every single case that went through the judicial system. And this lack of training led to so many, and it still leads to so many problems. So the fundamental understanding of the basics has just never been done properly. And I just, it's something that really bothers me, because it impacts a lot of the cases you see around law enforcement in the press are issues because of impacts of disclosure not being right. And in the corporate world, rarely in organizations do I see refresher training for interviews and investigations for investigators. And as Mary said, sometimes people are self-taught investigators and have never been trained. And also when people move across from law enforcement to corporate investigations, which is pretty common, they think a lot of the principles remain the same, but there is a slight difference in the investigations, and how a police officer would conduct an investigation isn't always appropriate in the corporate setting. You don't have the power to detain people and things like that. So just assuming that you know how investigations should be done because you know one facet of investigation, I think leads to issues of professionalism.
Yeah, thanks. I've seen that also in the legal profession. If their only experience was doing cross-examination of witnesses, that is in no way comparable to the type of investigation interview you need to conduct for somebody who's inadvertently leaked some data, sent an email to reply all, for example. You cannot be using those same interview techniques in that context. So really important for corporate investigators to get trained in how to conduct corporate investigations, and that's what we focus on as well as the ACI. Proportionality, really important that resourcing and decisions that are taken in the course of investigation are commensurate with the size, the severity, and the complexity of the task at hand. You want to, particularly in a corporate context, for me, an ideal situation is to conduct an investigation so discreetly that nobody knows it's it's taken place. You know, that I interview people outside of the office environment, and nobody knows that they're being interviewed. The worst thing is, you know, bringing in people in for interview and everyone knows something's going on. Getting my data centrally instead of having to upset other teams. There are various parallel evidencing techniques to get evidence so that you're not causing any kind of intrusion or disruption in the day-to-day business operations. And also proportionality speaks to pursuing relevant lines of inquiry, not kind of boiling the ocean. I know that particularly when you're working in ethics and compliance departments of organizations, there is sometimes a tendency to want to investigate, to want to extend your investigation to look at how the compliance program was rolled out. Do conflicts of interest declarations work in this area? And I have to go back and say, well, actually, no, that's not what we're doing here. We are actually doing an investigation into this terms of reference. So it's really important to have a terms of reference or an investigation plan that clearly sets out what your scope is going to be in that investigation. It's also important here in proportionality to consider timeliness. You know, sometimes there are deadlines the organization needs to meet, and it could be also a question of meeting the statute of limitations on certain types of issues that need to be reported. So yeah, I don't know if you want to say anything else about timeliness, Kate, at this point.
No, I think with timeliness, you know, there's so many things to consider, you know, like how long is that investigation going to take? You know, you're often asked that. It's how long is a piece of string, but you know, how long should you be looking back for, and what is going to be impacting that? And yeah, I just think with timeliness, there's a lot more that goes into it than just, you know, getting everything done as quickly as you can. And also just thinking about proportionality, you know, that sometimes you throw everything at something because it's a certain person involved, but is that proportionate? Would you be doing that if it was a different person that had been involved in the allegation? And so, yeah, proportionality covers so many different things. It's not as straightforward as it sounds.
Thanks. And safeguarding is an important principle that we've added in. It's not one that comes up in traditional investigation principle models outside of corporate investigations, but we have decided this is so important that we've included it. And it basically is a principle that you need to, as an investigator, ensure that your actions don't cause injury or injustice to others. So it kind of crosses over with fairness as well. It's about respecting the dignity of all parties, and also protecting people from retaliation. It's staggering the number of people who have been involved in an investigation as a subject of an investigation who then do not wish to return to the organization, even if they've been cleared of wrongdoing, because of the way they've been treated and stigmatized throughout the process. The overwhelming majority of people do not return to the workplace. They don't feel they can assimilate back into the workplace. Their reputation has been ruined. So it's a big responsibility for organizations to ensure that these investigations do not adversely impact on the parties to an investigation. This may mean giving some people garden leave, being very careful about how you talk about garden leave and suspending employees, because I've seen some very careless out of offices that clearly point to the fact that somebody's been suspended. Everything needs to be carefully planned with regard to the duty of care we owe to all parties to an investigation. In certain contexts as well, and I've worked in humanitarian, there is a principle called do no harm. It's really important that your investigation does not re-traumatize the reporters or the alleged victims. And re-traumatization inevitably does happen in many of our cases. I've dealt with some serious, rapes that have occurred in the workplace, where people are recalling the event in detail. They're reliving their experiences. They're suffering post-traumatic stress disorder. And so it's really important to be trained to conduct trauma-informed investigations, to recognize what trauma looks like, because they may not be answering the questions in the way that you think a logical person would be answering the question. They may recall fine details, but not recall details of that rape. Doesn't mean that they're not giving an accurate testimony. It's they are traumatized. So it's important to know how to conduct interviews sensitively, using the right wording, knowing not to antagonize people, knowing how to deal with difficult conversations, difficult interviews that can become aggressive, etc. So there are various techniques that a trained expert investigator will deploy in these cases. It's also important to, I think I keep on going on about trauma-informed investigative interviewing, but I think it's something that is not appreciated enough in the investigations world. We tend to want to get to our facts and get to know what's happening without regard for the person, what's the long-term consequences are going to be on that individual, on their well-being and their mental health. And I've seen some very extreme cases of where this has gone wrong with negative consequences on those individuals. So it's really important to provide safe space and to signpost resources for people who are going through trauma, and to make sure that you're non-judgmental when you're approaching anyone in an investigation. Oops, sorry. Finally, transparency. And I like transparency. It's so important. It's, as investigators, we know, most of us know what a case log is, or a decision log. We need to document all the steps and the decisions that we've taken to show where the facts came from, so that we can have the confidence to stand up to scrutiny, and to show why we made certain decisions, to demonstrate procedural fairness at all times. Loopholes can often be challenged in employment tribunals or in litigation, but also as for your own self as an investigator, to stand up and say that I can hand on heart say I made this decision for the right reasons, for my own integrity. Also have taking accountability for your mistakes, not omitting material information, really important. And also, as an investigator, if you believe that someone's adversely influencing your investigation or trying to obstruct your investigation, you need to have some channels to report that and to deal with those issues. And also update parties as appropriate, not leaving, if people are entitled to know that they will be safe in the workplace, then you should be informing them of what steps have been taken to ensure that they're safe to come back to work, or safe to be working in that environment as the investigation goes on. And it's always a balancing act between this and confidentiality, between the need to, we're not talking here about disclosing everything that you're doing. It's more about having a clear audit trail of all the steps you've taken so you can stand to the test of scrutiny. And I think that the biggest mistake investigators can make is to cover up abuses of their process, abuses of the investigative process.
And I think the transparency is really helpful, because later on, when you're questioned on your investigations in some kind of litigation, hindsight's a really wonderful thing, and I see it time and time again if things are reported in the press where why didn't this happen, why didn't they consider this? But you're dealing with what you're dealing with at the time and what you know at the time, so documenting that and having that transparency actually can help an investigator later on when they're being challenged as to why certain paths were followed.